And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Greeting, mariners. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service, and here is your Alaska marine weather outlook for the next couple of days here as we go through midweek. One thing I do want to pass along, I finally did get word on. We've been talking about the likelihood of the minimum sea ice occurring just prior to the equinox, and that's been the case. The National Sea Ice Data Center indicates, based on their observations, that minimum sea ice extent occurred on September 19th. It was the 7th lowest amount of ice minimum observed on record, and the disturbing trend continues that of the last 17 annual minimum extents, they have been the 17th lowest in 45 years of satellite record keeping. So that ominous trend of warming in the Arctic region continues, with the extent of the sea ice and the length for which it forms getting shorter. So definitely the warming is being observed here with the climate change across the Arctic region. It continues. And looking at the sea ice today, a little bit of ice showing up along areas of the Beaufort Sea coast, just beginning. Also here along the Russian Arctic coast, the west side of the Chukchi Sea. Otherwise, things are pretty open, as would be expected this time of year. But we do have a low pressure down near 980 millibars pushing up into the lower part of the Alaska Peninsula. And this frontal system is going to have gale and even some storm force winds with it tonight into Thursday. And we're also going to see the winds really pick up here across the lower Yukon Delta coastline, out of Norton Sound and around St. Lawrence Island, that could result in some higher surf. And by Thursday afternoon, we expect a little secondary development along kind of the triple point of the occluded front, where we still have a bit of a warm front, cold front, but a pretty good push of moisture, heavier rainfall around Yakutat into the Icy Strait corridor. 2 to as much as 4 inches of rain could fall, especially in any areas where there's enhanced lift due to the mountains. And then as that moisture pivots further north, it's going to encounter plenty of cold air here across the interior around the Alaska Range, up through Fairbanks, the 40-mile Gold Country. Another 1 to 3 inches of snow will be pretty common, and areas of the eastern Alaska Range could pick up as much as 6 inches of snowfall, especially Thursday night into Friday morning. And by the time we get into Friday, the front has pushed further inland northward and weakening, and a weaker area of low pressure then will reside there over Bristol Bay, the southeast corner of the Bering Sea. Looking at the marine forecast then for the Panhandle on Thursday, strongest winds are going to be along areas of the outer coast. Inner channels, a mixed bag of 15 to 20 knot winds, south-southeasterly from Ketchikan up through Petersburg around the Stevens Passage, with waves 4 or 5 feet. But north winds could gust as high as 35 knots down Lynn Canal, with waves building 3-4 feet there. And then out along the outer coast, south-southeast winds 25 knots. But once you get toward the Icy Strait corridor offshore there, we're looking at 35 to 40 knot easterly winds with waves of 13 to 17 feet, especially off of Cape Suckling. Winds come down, though, on Friday. Look for southeast to south winds 10 to 15 knots for the inner channels. Waves, though, still could be as high as 5-6 feet down here toward Dixon Entrance. South winds to 20 knots until you get up west of Gustavus, and then it's going to be more southeasterly winds 20 to 25 knots with waves of 11 to 12 feet. Now, for Thursday, strongest winds, especially in the morning, are going to be here around Kamishak Bay, lower Cook Inlet, around the Barren Islands and the entrance to Cook Inlet, just northeast of Kodiak Island, northeast to east, 50-knot gales with waves as high as 15 to 20 feet. We expect gale force winds also through middle Cook Inlet, as well as along the Kenai coast and extending back outside of Hinchinbrook entrance. Northeast winds, though, to 25 knots within Prince William Sound with 4-foot waves there. Winds will come down on Friday. We expect generally east to southeast winds across the region, 15 knots within Prince William Sound with 3-foot waves. Easterly winds there out of Turnagain Arm, Upper Cook Inlet, 3-foot waves. And then down through Lower Cook Inlet and the entrance there, southeast winds to 25 knots and waves 5 to as high as 9 feet, just northeast there of Kodiak Island. For Thursday, looking at the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, we have the low circulation pulling just north of Cold Bay. Southeast to east winds, 35-knot east winds within Shelikof Strait with 12-foot waves. Southeast to south winds, 25 knots here off of Sandpoint and off of Chicknick with waves of 10 feet. And then out of Norton Sound, or out of Bristol Bay, easterly winds to 35 knots, waves as high as 10, 11 feet. And then on the backside of the low, we expect winds to be trying to turn back around to more of a westerly direction and falling off. But looking at the winds on Friday, south to southeast winds 25 knots across Kodiak Island, and winds will tend to become more westerly, Cold Bay down to Falls Pass through the lower end of the peninsula, and drop off to 15 knots there north of Cold Bay, but remain southwest to west there across areas of the North Pacific with waves right around 8 to 10 feet. And we have the low center just kind of sitting just within Bristol Bay on Friday. For the Aleutians, eastern Aleutians, winds will be out of the west-northwest, 30 knots though they're in the vicinity of Dutch Harbor, waves 10 feet in the open waters in the northern Bering. Variable winds 10 knots across the central Bering, turning back to the west-southwest. And then on Friday, generally west winds across the eastern Aleutians as high as 25 knots there on Alaska in either side of that. But as we get back toward the western Aleutians, winds go north-northeast to 20 knots. And for the southwest coast, look at this. We have 35-knot northeasterly gales, 40-knot gales out of Bristol Bay. There'll be some higher gusts up potentially near 50 knots. And waves as high as 13 to 15 feet from the Pribilov Islands up through St. Matthew, but this is going to cause some higher surf potentially along areas of the Yukon Delta and coastline, as well as St. Lawrence Island and perhaps the west-north side there of Nunavik Island. By Friday, those winds are going to come down a bit, at least around Bristol Bay, the low center just southwest of there. Northeast wind 25 knots out of Kuskokwim Bay, north winds 20 knots at St. Paul. But look at still northeasterly gales to 35 knots out of Norton Sound and off of Imanak and Hooper Bay with waves 4 to 6 feet, and still some pretty good chop and surf there along the north side of St. Lawrence Island. For the Bering Strait, winds on the north side of St. Lawrence on Thursday will be out of the northeast 25 to 30 knots with waves 5 to 8 feet. Winds are going to fall off and shift more to the north-northwest at 15 knots, especially as you get north of Point Hope. And then generally along the Arctic coast, there, the Beaufort Sea coastline, west to southwest winds 15 knots with waves 4 feet. And on Friday, winds up this way will be along the Arctic coast, north-northwest, 15 to 20 knots. And then going more northeasterly, once you get down in the Chukchi Sea, look for northeast winds increasing 20 to 30 knots through the Bering Strait and 30 to 35 knot winds on Friday, especially on the north side of St. Lawrence Island, with waves within this area anywhere from 6 to as high as 11 feet.